Good afternoon. Yes, when several months ago Antonio called me to propose to organize something to remember Luca Cavalli Sforza, who left us last year, we agreed that we wanted to speak of his contribution to some of the areas of genetics to which he contributed, which are many, and at the same time to give you an update on what is going on right now. So this is Luca. We all met him in person, I think, most of us, perhaps not all of us. I won't even try to summarize his career and his contributions to genetics in a few words. But I need to give you at least a brief explanation of the title, of my talk, which unfortunately is incorrect. In 1990, Luca Cavalli Sforza was invited to give a series of classes at the Collège de France in Paris. 1990, 29 years ago. And he immediately wrote his book in Italian, but the book was translated in English by Mark Seilstedt and appeared in 1991, 28 years ago. And then it was translated in Italian in 1996, 23 years ago. And then a paper with the same name, with the same title, appeared in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 1997. So I'm afraid there's no way to say that we are 20 years later now, but we are roughly 20 years later. And because our discipline deals with probability much more than with certainty, I think we should agree that 20 years is an acceptable approximation. Luca contributed to many fields of genetics. I just want to remind you that he started as a bacterial geneticist, and he was the one who discovered the high-frequency recombination in Escherichia coli. There is still a site in the Escherichia coli genome called Cavalli, because it's where the cut of the chromosome begins for the transfer in Escherichia coli conjugation. He was among the first ones who began to challenge the common dominating Darwinian hypothesis that most of the traits evolve under natural selection, stressing the importance of genetic drift, which was considered up to that point sometimes a sort of nuisance, something preventing our theories, our equations to be perfectly accurate. And with his studies in Valparma, here in Italy, and then on the pygmies, he began to stress and to highlight the importance of random phenomena in population divergence and evolution. And then, of course, there was his major contribution to the Human Genome Diversity Project, in the phase in which huge investments were being made for the sequencing of the first human genome. Luca was among the first ones who stressed that one genome is not enough, because each of us has a certain set of features, and obtained the funds and the connections and created the networks, which led to this project, Human Genome Diversity Project, and to the creation of these biobanks based in Paris, the CEF biobank. And actually, these are the populations that are now represented in this biobank. It's some sort of reminder of Luca's trips, because many of these populations were sampled by him in various phases of his career. But in this book, in these papers, his main contribution focused on Europe. And so, contrary to what I wrote in my abstract, I will just focus on Europe and not on many other aspects of his research. And everything started with this. It's sort of moving for people of my age or older to look at these images. Luca told me that he received access to a large database assembled by NATO, probably with some sort of purposes related to biological warfare or something of this kind. At a certain point, they realized that they couldn't find a gene to poison only the Vietnamese and not the other soldiers. And so this huge archive of allele frequencies were made public and given to him. Oh, this is the way he told this story. And with Alberto Piazza and Paolo Menozzi, they devised a technique to represent on a map not a single allele frequency, as was common up to that point, but a whole set of allele frequencies. He called them synthetic maps. I won't enter into the details, but these maps that you see were generated by super advanced computers in 1978, which had a screen, not a printer, but a screen that was state of the art. And then they put a camera in front of the screen and took a picture, which was then developed and printed. And that's a cover of Science, in which you see there's a gradient of colors from the corner, from the southeastern to the northwestern corner of the map of Europe. The message here is that allele frequencies for many, many genes are distributed in a regular pattern in Europe. And perhaps you will see it better, in this map, which comes from a later paper. So, allele frequencies show a remarkable degree of order in Europe. Why? Can this be due to just chance? It's easy to prove that that is not possibly the case. And then Luca and his collaborators decided to be open-minded, to look elsewhere for information. And elsewhere meant to speak with the archaeologists. And they found that there is a very similar map describing what might seem a completely independent phenomenon. Here, this map doesn't describe genes anymore. It's a map with the dates of the oldest Neolithic artifacts in Europe and in the Near East. And as you see, the two maps mirror each other very nicely, very nicely. So there is a correspondence between the tools, the objects, the ceramic, for instance, showing evidence of Neolithic artifacts and the distribution of genes in Europe. Perhaps I should also say that Neolithic is a crucial word in archaeology. We think we are like 190,000 years old as Homo sapiens, and for 18/19 of this time, we just collected the food that was available by hunting and gathering. Only in the last 10,000 years, we began to produce food, and this led to a dramatic increase in population sizes and deep changes in the social organization. For instance, we were semi-nomadic, and we became stable. We began to build cities, and in the cities, social layers began to differentiate. The people began to have different tasks and different incomes, and many things developed. The point at which this change occurred is the beginning of the Neolithic or the Neolithic Revolution. And according to the archaeological evidence, the Neolithic Revolution was accompanied by a major population growth, demographic growth. So Luca connected the two pieces of evidence, actually three, archaeological evidence, genetic evidence, and the idea that the archaeological evidence is connected with the demographic growth, and presented a model that could justify what you see on the right, the genes, on the basis of what you see on the left, the spread of the Neolithic. The idea is not so simple. It's not simply that there is a migration and migrations generate clients. We know that we have large numbers of people from Romania immigrating into Italy in the last few years, but there is no gradient from Romania into Italy. So migration by itself cannot account for very broad gradients or clients, such as the ones that we saw right now. It takes a more complicated process, and this process starts with, here in this model, just three populations. They are equally small, meaning that these circles are equally small, meaning that the populations are small. There's a low population density, but you see one of the circles is blue, meaning there is agriculture there. These people can produce food, the others can't. And so what happens is that the blue population begins to grow in size. The limit to this growth is connected with the availability of resources on the territory, the size of the arable land. And so at a certain point, that population will reach a limit. It cannot any longer grow in that place, so they have to move, which is something we humans are very familiar with. And they move to the next locality in the model. And in the next locality, this movement of people has a first effect, which is not so important. I mean, their population increases a little bit because new people are arriving. But if the two groups don't mix right away, the blue ones will keep the ability to increase in size. The yellow ones will not. And so, at the end of the growth, the second population will be genetically more similar to the one to the right than to the one to the left. And if this cycle continues, you can show it by elegant equations, the end result will be a broad gradient spanning even very large territories. So this is the model that Luca Cavalli Sforza termed Neolithic demic diffusion, meaning farming reached Europe not because people learned how to farm from those who had started it in the Near East, but because the farmers themselves moved with their genes and came to occupy Europe. We'll come back to this later on, because now we have an idea of the quantitative impact of this migration from the Near East into Europe. Now, when people move, when people migrate, they bring with themselves their genes, of course, their culture, and a major component of the culture is the language. So, is it possible to make a connection, a further connection, not only between archaeology and genetics, but also between among archaeology, genetics, and linguistics? And imagine that these processes, these movements of people, were also responsible for the spread of the major language families. This is by no means a new idea. The first one who mentioned this possibility was no less than Charles Darwin, who said that if we had a perfect evolutionary tree of humankind, then we would also have the best representation of language diversity in the world. It was just an intuition. He didn't have data to support this. But maybe now we can try to see if there's something useful in Darwin's intuition, if a correspondence between genes and languages is more the exception or the rule. For a matter of simplicity, I will just focus on the Indo-European languages here, both because we're speaking of Europe and because the Indo-European languages are by far the most deeply studied area of linguistics, of the historical linguistics. As for the Indo-European languages, traditionally linguists divided into groups. Everybody divides into groups when there's something interesting to discuss in science. A traditional view was due to the work of this linguist from former Soviet Union. She was Lithuanian, Maria Gimbutas. Maria Gimbutas thought that the Indo-European languages, I don't know if you can see it, came from the Pontic steppes north of the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. And then they spread all over Europe and the Near East through a series of migrations represented by those arrows. She said so basically based on archaeological evidence. And one problem with this hypothesis is that all these arrows are not associated with any known migration, or were not associated at that time with any known migration phenomenon. So she was putting arrows on the map without really knowing whether or not people had actually moved at the right time along those lines. And so, a few years later, an English archaeologist, Colin Renfrew, objected that there is no need to imagine many migration phenomena since we already have a good one, the spread of Neolithic people from Anatolia, from the Near East, into Europe. And so he said, is there any good reason not to believe that the spread of Indo-European languages here was just a consequence of the demic diffusion of early farmers from Anatolia into Europe? And his model was a little bit more complex, including other types of demic diffusion, which I will not talk about. So this was a situation in the phase in which Luca Cavalli Sforza began to work in this area, and the debate went on for a while. We had some joint meetings with geneticists and linguists. Frankly, we didn't speak the same language, so many of these meetings were not very exciting. People would stay on their initial positions for long. We would argue about the possibility to compare languages and genes. Most linguists would believe that it was like comparing apples and oranges, this type of things. But in recent years, with the development of sophisticated technologies to type the DNA, including ancient DNA in the fossils, Now we have a lot of evidence that was missing from the debate when it took place in the, let's say, in the mid-90s. And so now we know a lot of other things. I will just show you a few pieces of evidence. My talk could last almost forever. 4 years ago, the group led by David Reich in Harvard studied a large number of ancient samples in Europe. I think you don't read here, but these samples spanned the period of time from the Mesolithic, so when we were still hunters and gatherers all over the continent, to the Bronze Age. And of course, the distribution of these samples is all but optimal. There are areas which have been excavated very deeply, and so we know a lot about those areas, but areas in which we have very little evidence. And the result was that it was possible to identify 3 major components in the Europeans' genomes. 3 major components means that all of us have in different proportions these components in our genome, and then there are other minor components which are more difficult to identify and to attribute to some historical phenomenon. Okay. So, if we start from the bottom, here we have the same samples that you saw in the map, historical samples, going from the early Neolithic to the late Bronze Age. And here we have a number of contemporary European populations. The early Neolithic people, you see, are characterized by this orange color in their genomes. Then, starting from the Bronze Age, this green color begins to come in, a green color that was basically absent up to a point. And the blue areas here are areas of the genome in which you have a good similarity with the genomes of Mesolithic people, so the people who came first. So in other words, blue comes first, orange comes later, and green comes at the end of the story in the Bronze Age. The European samples that you see here are arranged north to south. So what we can see here is that in Southern Europe, the orange component, the Neolithic component, most likely brought in by the Neolithic massive migration from the Near East, is the main one. But as you proceed north, the Bronze Age component becomes significant and then in the end dominant. In Northern Europe, the green area represents the largest part of the genomes. Of course, this is the average genome in that population, and you should remember that the variation around this average is very large in humans, okay? Here and there, you have some reminders of the Mesolithic, or the early blue component. So this seems to show that, Luca was right when he analyzed 150 allele frequencies rather than hundreds of thousands of SNPs. He got it right. But that the phenomenon that he described in the simple terms that were possible in the late 80s now can be regarded in a more sophisticated way. And I hope I will be able to show it to you. Yeah, no. Okay, let's go further. This is what I was looking for. So this is a sort of synthesis of the demographic changes in Europe according to ancient DNA evidence. Pre-farming, so this means a phase which ended when the first Neolithic farmers moved in from the Near East. But because the process took 5,000 years, pre-farming means different periods of times in different areas of Europe. Everybody was a hunter-gatherer, the blue component in the graph earlier on, and here you see a brown circle, because now we know the skin color of these people, and they were dark-skinned. I'll come back to this in a moment. Then, in the Neolithic, the early farmers come in from Anatolia, and we have the first evidence, the first ancient DNA evidence of light skins. The light skins that now are common in Europe, in the Caucasus, 13 to 15,000 years ago. So white-skinned farmers come in, interact with hunter-gatherers, but they have a more powerful means of subsistence. And in the end, they come to represent a larger fraction of the population. And here you see around 6,000 years ago, occupying most of Europe. And then at a later time, the green component, this was the orange component, the green component of the genomes comes in from the north. and has a different impact in the north and in the south of Europe. And here you can see a line around Sardinia, because Sardinia apparently was basically immune from this gene flow process and kept the genomic features of the previous period of the Neolithic. This is a synthetic picture we are assembling, and of course, as the data increase, as the analysis become more sophisticated, this picture will have to change, but I think not dramatically so in the future. I was speaking of skin colors. I think this is an interesting story. Skin color. Yes, skin color is one of those complex traits that we fail to fully understand. We know at least 70 genes contributing to skin color. And of course, it's not just a genetic trait, because if you go in the sun, you get suntan, so your skin color changes due to also to environmental factors. The basic process is the production of these grains that are made of two types of melanin, eumelanin, which is sort of brownish, reddish, and pheomelanin, which is yellowish. The grains of melanin are then spread towards the more superficial cells, and our skin color depends on the number of grains, on their size, and on the relative contribution of the two types of melanin. Well, there are now hypotheses on what happened to skin color during our evolution, because skin color, of course, doesn't leave any fossil remain. Nina Jablonski, whom you see there, is the main expert of the world in skin colors, and she claims, and I think most of us believe her, that at the beginning our skins were white, because if you open the hair on the breast of a chimp or a gorilla, the skin down there is white. During our evolution, we lost hair, as we know, and the phenomenon is not completely understood. But under the African sun, it's not a good idea to have a light skin, because you are more subject to cancer and to other defects like that. And the names that you see here are all genes in which the mutation can be attributed to one of these phases. Here we have the past, our African past. Here we have the present. And in between, there were mutations contributing to a darkening of the skin until we reached very dark skins. And then when someone moved to Asia and Europe, the selection process was inverted, because under limited sun exposure, it's a good thing to have a light skin to better use vitamin D, which is so crucial in lactation, in pregnancy, and so on and so forth. We had no idea when this happened, but we thought that basically as soon as some people moved out of Africa, the skins became light very quickly. And because now we think that we went out of Africa 70,000 years ago, perhaps, we thought that, by 60,000 years ago, Europeans were white and Asians were too. Perhaps 30 Asians and then the Europeans. No way. Now we have studied. We have studied several fossil remains using some expert systems in which basically you, instead of trying to figure out the phenotype based on the genes, which so far has been impossible, you train a computer to recognize the skin color of several people of known skin color based on a number of genes. Then you can repeat the operation to check the precision of the system. And I think the data I'm talking about have a 3% margin of error. But this guy here, the guy in the middle, coming from this skull found in a place in England called Cheddar, you also see a hole in the skull because this person was killed, perhaps in a ritual, perhaps because he was a prisoner, we don't know. The DNA extracted from this skull gave very strong evidence of a combination of phenotypic traits that's very uncommon in Europe now. Dark skin, and with dark I mean really dark, you can see it here, and blue eyes. 10,000 years ago, one Englishman had this phenotype. And here you see the Dutch twins, the Kennis twins, who are the artists responsible for assembling this image of what Cheddar Man could have looked like. He's not the only one. He was not a single dark-skinned migrant, because we repeated the analysis, and now a colleague of mine is doing it on a broad scale in Ferrara on 3 other samples. You see them here from Luxembourg, from Spain, and from Switzerland, and all of them had dark skin, and 2 of them had blue eyes. So, and there's also dark-skinned European here, but this is a different story. So it seems that, and here you see the reconstructions of the physical appearance of these people. So the light skins, of which us Europeans are sort of proud, or anyway we think are just one of our main features, came by migration in Europe. No migration, no light skins. It's a little bit ironic, but I won't comment on it. But let's go back to languages for the last few slides of my talk. So there is this open question I mentioned earlier on. Where do the Indo-European speakers first came from? Do they come from the Pontic steppes? Do they come from the Near East? Now, as you have seen, we know that there were indeed migrations from Russia, from the Pontic steppes into Europe. So at least a few of the arrows marked on the map by Maria Gimbutas are also supported by some sort of genetic evidence. Several papers of David Reich's group and collaborators insisted that the evidence for this migration was also evidence of the arrival of Indo-European languages from this area. Some people disagree, both in the old times and in more recent times. The big problem is that none of these papers contained linguistic information. So these papers showed that indeed there were documented migration movements from the Pontic steppes into Europe, but whether or not they were also associated with some linguistic change was not shown there. And so perhaps it's better to, if you want to understand languages, to study languages and not to study other things, and then perhaps compare the results of this analysis with other results. I show you here a paper I find very interesting. It was published 15 years ago. Russell Gray is an evolutionary biologist from Australia. Now he is based in Germany, who decided to approach linguistic problems under an evolutionary viewpoint. And the tree you see here is a tree connecting all Indo-European languages, in which the distances are not genetic distances, like in the trees we are most familiar with, but linguistic distances based on the comparison of the words according to some criteria that I don't want to discuss right now. The interesting thing is that the root of the tree is dated at around 9,000 years ago, which is more or less the period in which the first Neolithic farmers began to move into Europe. I must add that to put a date on these trees, you need to have an estimate of the mutation rate. And estimating mutation rates in genetics is sort of complicated, but we've sort of figured out how to do it. In linguistics, apparently, it's much more complicated. So these numbers were not taken very well by most linguists. But Russell Gray and his collaborators went on and estimated, based on the vocabulary comparisons, the most likely area of origin of Indo-European languages. And here you can see in this map that as you go towards the red, the probability increases. So you see that Anatolia is the area from which there is the highest probability of origin of this language. And then they compared Anatolia with the areas in which, according to Maria Gimbutas, Indo-European languages might have originated. And the result of this analysis is that an Anatolian origin, according to their calculations, is some 150 over 200 folds as likely as an origin in the Pontic steppes. I don't know whether this is the end of the story. I don't think so. But anyway, here we have a quantitative assessment of linguistic diversity. The problem here, how much time do I have, Antonio? I can go on. I have, that's right. The problem here is that languages are not only made of words. And actually, words are easy to study because you can compare words across languages and see if they are the same or not. But there are some complications. This is a map of the major language families of the world according to some linguists. Linguists are not really all of the same opinion on this. Anyway, Merritt Ruhlen, who collaborated for long with Luca, Cavalli, Sforza and others, thinks that these are the major language families of the world. 17 language families plus a few linguistic isolates that are difficult to locate. One is Basque. Everybody knows Basque as an isolate. Now, if you compare words, I don't know if you can read from down there. Here we have the words for the numbers 1, 2, and 7. In 5 Indo-European languages in white, and you see 1, 2, 7. In Romanian it's unu, doi, sapte. And linguists can find a connection also with the Armenian mek, yerku, and yot, which don't seem the same thing to us, but we are not linguists, and that's why they don't seem so similar. If you move to other language families, marked in different colors, by definition, the etymologies of the words must have nothing in common. Okay, so the words in the Afroasiatic family, in the Sino-Tibetan family, in the Altaic family should have no connections with the European words, Indo-European words. Yakut is a language spoken in Yakutia, northern Siberia, and I don't know if you can read here, but the number 7 is sette, which may sound familiar to the Italian speakers in here. This is not the consequence of some unprecedented relationships between us Italians and the people in Yakutia. It's simply due to the fact that the number of sounds we can produce is large but not unlimited, and so there are these random correspondences. So the question is, how do we compare languages of different families where, by definition, the usage of the lexicon doesn't lead us to anything because we have zero correspondence? One possibility has been developed by the studies of this linguist. He was in Trieste, then he moved to York, Giuseppe Longobardi, Pino Longobardi, who noticed, and this is what is called generally the Chomskyan analysis of the languages from Noam Chomsky, the American expert of languages. There are some features of languages, some deep features of languages in the grammar and in the syntax that can be compared across different families. Here I have an example of the simplest one because I don't understand the more complicated ones. But the order in which you have subject, object, and verb in various languages, we have 3 items here, so we have 6 possible orders, changes across languages. So there are cases like she loves him, subject, verb, object, which are typical of English, also of Italian, Hausa in Africa, Mandarin in China. The most common order is actually subject, object, and verb, and you find it in Pashtun, in Afghanistan, in Japanese, in Africans, and so on and so forth. But all word orders are present, some of them in very, very few languages. So by focusing on these abstract features of languages, grammar and syntax, you can make these large-scale comparisons. You can compare languages coming from very different parts of the world. And we are working on this project, and there will be a poster for those of you who want to see it. It's called parametric comparison method. It includes some very complicated passages I don't want to talk about right now, but I will be happy to discuss with you if you want. The first thing is that by this method, you obtain plausible language taxonomies. If you turn the distances into a tree, this is a UPGMA tree, you see the Indo-European languages clustering together, the Altaic languages, the Uralic languages clustering together. So the results of this analysis, at least at the first sight, make sense, make linguistic sense. The second thing you can do is to try to look into the genomes of the people speaking those languages once you have identified the relationships with this method. And I want to finish with this slide because it brings back the subject of the place of origin of the Indo-European languages. Here you see at the bottom 5 populations speaking Indo-European languages. And the genome components here we call the Neolithic, Bronze Age, and Siberian, because we are also speaking of populations of Asia. And so the hunting-gathering contribution to the genome is less. You see, Indo-European speakers have a lot of orange, have a lot of Neolithic components in their genome, plus some Bronze Age components. But the Bronze Age components is dominant in the Uralic speakers of Asia, Maris, Udmurs, and Khanty, and it's less in 3 populations who speak these languages, but they are in Europe. So they speak an Asian, a language of an Asian language family, but they are physically in Europe. So the interpretation that we give to this image is that apparently where Indo-European is spoken, the component coming from the Near East is very, very strong. But it's very strong also in European populations who adopted a different language, probably because this language, this linguistic change, was not due to a massive immigration of people from Asia, but to some sort of cultural change in which some European features were maintained in populations adopting a new language. The field is still very fertile. There will be a lot of work to do. Speak with Patricia Santos, who is in this audience, if you want to know more about this analysis. Luca, Cavalli, Sforza also spoke of something that most of us don't like to talk about, the future. We tend to say that we are scientists, so we know something about the present and the past, but certainly you cannot predict the future. But in his book was a book that had to speak to many, many people, many more than those who attend scientific meetings. And so in the last pages, he was asked about the future, or he decided to speak about the future. And he says something that I really like very much, and I like to show it to you. This is my English translation of the Italian translation of his book. So I'm not 100% sure that he wrote exactly these words. But he said that the human future at the genetic level is not very interesting. It's not very interesting because it's unlikely that there will be major changes. These changes will certainly be less important than those that occurred so far. Because as a matter of fact, the development of culture, another crucial area of interest of Luca Cavalli Sforza's, has reduced the speed of biological evolution in humans. Major evolutionary changes often occur in small populations. Small isolated populations are the place in which something may happen very fast. We are 7.5 billion, soon becoming 8 billion, and we are very much interconnected. Luca thought that in the future we should not expect major changes in our genomes, but of course major changes in our culture are to be expected. And I like to finish by showing you once again his smile. Thank you for your attention.
There are questions? Is working? Yeah. Questions for Guido? Nice talk, very nice. It's an open field. There is a lot of debate on this last part. Still controversial. It's controversial from many years, but there is a lot of new data. Questions?
It's going to be an icebreaker question. So Guido, thank you for the talk. That was great as usual. Could you think about a cultural marker? Because it seems like we understood everything about genes and nothing's going to change much. And also, you did people around other research on your group as well. You did great work with languages. Could you think about some other sort of cultural markers, like?
There are many. The reason why we and other people focus on language is that cultural traits tend to change very fast. Think about political borders. Think about religions. So language, among the many cultural traits that one can take into account, has the advantage to be relatively stable. You have to take some precautions. Of course, most people speak English around the world. Most people are multilingual, actually, around the world. More than 50% of humankind, according to the data I found, are multilingual, speak different languages. And so, you have to use some approximations. But basically, you have an idea of what was going on in the last centuries, if you consider languages. Religions are also a possible marker. The idea is that if there is a cultural barrier, people will not tend to cross it very easily when they marry. And there will be some social pressure towards marrying with members of the same linguistic, religious, social layer community. Social layers are also a factor. You know, we know that for a poor boy, it's difficult to marry a rich girl or vice versa. But there is still some mobility, even in the Italian society, even though it doesn't look so. And so, you know, social layers change quickly. And the son of a banker can easily be unemployed, and so on and so forth. So languages seem to be the simplest trait to study. Recently, I know of a group of people, Eugenio Bortolini was among them, who studied the connection between genes and folk tales, finding some sort of connection. Marco.
Just something. Do languages change by drift, by chance, or by some selection? What's your idea?
Languages change by a number of phenomena. In some cases, they are. You know, Darwin's intuition was that the demographic changes affecting populations and leaving a mark at the genetic level will also leave a mark at the cultural level. That's the intuition. The complicating factors are many. Because, for instance, you can learn a language when you move to another place, but your genes will not learn to be like the genes of the people you moved to. Adopted children, you know, many factors. Or phenomena like the ones we saw probably in Hungary, which is called elite dominance. A small group of people moves in and imposes their language because it becomes the official language of the place, the trade language. So if you want to trade with other people, you have to speak that language. Which is more or less what happened also to German in our Alps, in which Romance languages were spoken until the Middle Age, and then German came in. But the remarkable finding is that despite all these complicating factors, whenever you look for a correlation between languages and genes, you tend to observe it. And then you find exceptions which are as interesting as the rule, of course. So the rule is that Darwin was right, that in many cases the same processes led to both biological and cultural differentiation of populations. And then the exceptions are populations in which something happened, and it's interesting to try to figure out what happened.
Additional questions? I guess we have to begin to colonize new planets in order to reactivate evolution. Thank you, Guido. Thank you a lot. So